Billionaires do not do blind dates. They execute mergers. But when a ruthless tech CEO dragged her 7-year-old deaf daughter to a forced weekend lunch, she expected another tedious disaster. She anticipated a man who would talk over them, gawk at her wealth, and pity her child. She didn't expect a tired, single dad with calloused hands. And she certainly didn't expect him to kneel down, ignore her entirely, and speak to her daughter in fluent, perfect sign language. Rain slicked the floor-to-ceiling windows of the boardroom, blurring the Seattle skyline into a smear of grey and bruised purple. Fiona pressed 2 manicured fingers to the bridge of her nose. The air in the room smelled of stale espresso and the sharp, ozone tang of overworked servers. Across the mahogany table, 3 men in suits that cost more than a compact car were arguing over a fraction of a percent in a logistics acquisition. Fiona didn't care. For the first time in her career, the numbers just looked like dead insects on a glowing screen. She checked her watch. A heavy platinum Patek Philippe that felt more like a shackle today than a status symbol. 3:15 p.m. She had 45 minutes to sever this meeting, navigate through the gridlocked downtown core, pick up Chloe from her specialized school, and somehow transform from a corporate apex predator into a functioning human being for a date she never agreed to. "Wrap it up, gentlemen," Fiona said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the aggressive edge they were used to. It carried a raspy exhaustion that made the room fall silent. "We hold at 4%, not a decimal less. If they balk, we walk. I have somewhere to be." She didn't wait for their nods. She grabbed her trench coat, heavy, stiff gabardine, and walked out. The elevator descent was a sensory deprivation chamber. Smooth, silent, smelling faintly of the lemon polish used on the brass rails. Fiona closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the cold, mirrored wall. She was 34, worth a sum with 9 zeros, and utterly terrified of the next 3 hours. Her sister Claire was the architect of this impending disaster. "You're turning into a spreadsheet, Viv," Claire had said over the phone yesterday. The background noise of her own chaotic household, a stark contrast to Fiona's sterile penthouse. "His name is Brian. He's a landscape architect. He has a boy a year older than Chloe. Just go. Eat a salad. Pretend you have a pulse." Fiona hadn't wanted to go. She hadn't been on a date since David left. David, who had looked at a 12-month-old Chloe's audiology test results, packed a leather duffel bag and muttered something about not being built for this before vanishing into the humid Miami night. The underground parking garage was damp and smelled of exhaust and wet concrete. Fiona slid into the driver's seat of her Range Rover, the leather cold and unyielding against her back. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She loved Chloe. God, she loved that little girl with a ferocity that bordered on violence. But love did not magically grant competence. Fiona was a woman who solved problems by throwing capital and intellect at them. Deafness wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a reality to be lived. And Fiona was failing at it. She paid for the best tutors, the best visual aids, the most exclusive private education. But when it was just the 2 of them in the cavernous penthouse, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a suffocating, heavy blanket. Fiona's American Sign Language was stilted, robotic. She possessed the vocabulary of a textbook, but lacked the fluid, expressive syntax of a native speaker. Chloe, perceptive and sharp, knew it. The child had started retreating, her bright green eyes masking a profound, isolating boredom. The drive to the school was a blur of brake lights and the rhythmic, aggressive slap of the windshield wipers. When Fiona walked into the brightly lit foyer of the academy, the smell hit her immediately. A nostalgic, slightly nauseating mix of finger paint, floor wax, and apple juice. Chloe was sitting on a low bench near the cubbies, her small legs swinging. She wore a yellow raincoat that made her look like a tiny, solitary beacon. Fiona approached and tapped the wall lightly, a visual cue. Chloe looked up. There was no bright smile, just a solemn acknowledgement. Fiona's hands moved awkwardly, her fingers stiff. "Ready, go?" Chloe signed back, her movements small, quick and effortless. "Yes." "Where?" "Food. Meet man and boy." Fiona signed, hating how blunt and ungraceful she looked. Chloe just stared, her face entirely neutral, before sliding off the bench and taking Fiona's hand. Her palm was small, a little sticky, and impossibly warm. As they walked back to the car, Fiona felt the familiar, ugly twist of guilt in her gut. She was a billionaire who commanded rooms of hostile executives, but holding her daughter's hand, she felt like an imposter who had stolen someone else's child. The restaurant Claire had chosen was aggressively modern. It was called Lumina, a cavern of exposed brick, brushed steel, and Edison bulbs suspended on thick black cords. The air smelled of roasted garlic, truffle oil, and damp wool coats. For Fiona, it was just another overpriced bistro. For Chloe, it was a visual minefield. As soon as they stepped inside, Fiona felt Chloe's grip tighten. A deaf child's world is intensely visual and highly sensitive to vibration. Lumina was full of sharp, contrasting lights, flickering shadows, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the espresso machine vibrating through the floorboards. Chloe shrank against Fiona's leg, her eyes darting around, processing 1,000 micro-movements of waiters, patrons, and swinging kitchen doors. "Reservation for Fiona," she told the host, a young man with an asymmetrical haircut who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He led them to a booth in the back. Sitting there were two figures. Fiona's immediate, cynical assessment kicked in. Brian did not look like a man who belonged in a restaurant that charged $40 for a scallop. He wore a faded, charcoal grey Henley under an unbuttoned corduroy jacket. His shoulders were broad, but he sat with a slight slump, as if chronically exhausted. He had a strong jaw, week-old stubble, and eyes the colour of steeped tea. Next to him was a boy, maybe 8 years old, with a messy mop of brown hair, furiously colouring a paper placemat with a single red crayon. When Brian saw them approach, he stood up. He didn't smooth his hair or adjust his collar. He just offered a polite, tired smile. "Fiona," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone. It sounded like boots on gravel. "Brian, I apologise we're late. Traffic off the I-5 was a parking lot," Fiona said, slipping into her corporate cadence. Crisp, efficient, guarded. She slid into the booth, guiding Chloe to sit beside her. Brian sat back down. His son didn't even look up from his colouring. "This is Toby," Brian said, tapping the boy's shoulder. Toby glanced up, offered a gap-toothed grin, and immediately went back to aggressive scribbling. "He's in a deeply committed relationship with that crayon." Fiona forced a tight, polite laugh. It sounded hollow even to her. "This is Chloe," she said. Brian looked at Chloe. He didn't offer a patronising wave. He didn't speak loudly, a mistake most hearing people made when introduced to a deaf person. He just offered a gentle nod and a warm, crinkling smile at the corners of his eyes. Chloe stared at him, unblinking, before dropping her gaze to the table. She began to trace the grain of the wood with her index finger, completely tuning out the environment. The silence that followed was dense. Fiona picked up the heavy, leather-bound menu to avoid looking at the man across from her. "So, Claire tells me you run a tech firm," Brian said, breaking the ice with the clumsiness of a man who hadn't done this in a very long time. I am the CEO of a data analytics conglomerate, yes, Fiona corrected, perhaps too sharply. She hated the reductive label of tech firm. Brian raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip from a glass of tap water. He had large hands. The knuckles were rough, the skin tanned and marked with tiny, faded white scars. These were hands that worked dirt and stone, not keyboards. Data analytics, Brian repeated, rolling the words around. Sounds heavy. It's primarily algorithmic forecasting for supply chain logistics. Not exactly dinner conversation, Fiona said, placing the menu down. She was already building walls, brick by cynical brick. She could see the mismatch. He was a guy who built gardens. She dismantled corporations. She felt a sudden, irrational flash of anger at Claire for putting her in this position, forcing her to play the role of the aloof, rich woman. Fair enough, Brian said mildly. He didn't seem intimidated. If anything, he looked amused. I move dirt around, plant things, try to keep them from dying. A noble pursuit, Fiona said dryly. She glanced down at Chloe. Her daughter was rhythmically tapping the base of the salt shaker against the table. Tap, tap, tap. A self-soothing mechanism to deal with the visual chaos of the room. Fiona gently placed her hand over Chloe's to stop the movement. Chloe stiffened, pulling her hand away and crossing her arms over her chest. Fiona felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She was failing again, right in front of a stranger. "She okay?" Brian asked, his voice dropping a register, losing the polite date chatter tone. Fiona bristled. "She's fine, it's just a busy environment. She's deaf, so she relies entirely on visual input. Places like this are loud for her." She hated explaining it. She hated the inevitable look of pity that was about to wash over Brian's face. She braced herself for the standard responses. "Oh, I'm so sorry," or "that must be so hard." But Brian didn't say either of those things. He just looked at the flickering Edison bulbs above them, then at the chaotic open kitchen, and nodded slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "Must feel like a strobe light in here." Fiona paused, caught off guard. It was a surprisingly astute observation. She opened her mouth to reply, but the waiter arrived, a whirlwind of manufactured enthusiasm and reciting evening specials that sounded more like a foreign language. The waiter, a man with a booming voice and overly animated hand gestures, leaned over the table. "And for the little ones?" he asked, looking directly at Toby, then turning his loud, projecting voice toward Chloe. "We have a fantastic artisanal mac and cheese, or a grilled chicken breast with seasonal veg. What do you say, sweetie?" Chloe, feeling the shift in air current and noticing the man staring at her with wide, expectant eyes, shrank back against the leather booth. The waiter was leaning too close, his exaggerated facial expressions deeply confusing. Fiona felt the immediate hot spike of maternal defense. "She doesn't..." But Chloe, trying to be independent, pointed a small finger at a picture on the back of the kids' menu. It was a bowl of plain, buttered noodles. "The chicken?" the waiter boomed, completely misinterpreting her gesture. "Excellent choice." Chloe shook her head vehemently and pointed again, harder, at the noodles. "The burger? Honey, you got to use your words," the waiter chuckled, looking at Fiona for translation. Fiona's heart hammered. She reached out, her fingers clumsy and panicked. "No chicken. Noodles." She tried to sign to Chloe, but her anxiety made the gestures sharp and unintelligible. Chloe looked at Fiona's hands, frustrated, and let out a small, sharp vocalization. A sound of pure exasperation that made the waiter physically recoil. Fiona closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. "I am a disaster. She wants the buttered noodles." Brian's voice cut through the awkwardness. It wasn't loud, but it was incredibly firm, the kind of voice that stops a dog in its tracks. The waiter blinked, recovering his customer service smile. "Right. Noodles. Got it." He scribbled on his pad and practically fled the table. Fiona let out a shaky breath, pressing her hands flat against the cold surface of the table. "Thank you," she muttered, not looking at Brian. She felt exposed, the billionaire CEO reduced to a flustered mess over a bowl of pasta. She looked at Chloe. The little girl had pulled her knees to her chest, her face buried in her arms. A complete shutdown. Fiona reached out to touch her shoulder, to try and sign an apology, to do something. Before she could, Brian leaned forward. He didn't touch Chloe. He didn't try to force her to look at him. He simply placed both of his large, calloused hands on the table, right in Chloe's line of sight where her face was buried. He tapped the table with a specific, rhythmic vibration. Thump-thump, pause, thump-thump. Chloe's head snapped up, her green eyes wide, looking for the source of the vibration. She looked at Brian. Brian didn't smile, an overly bright, patronizing smile. He kept his face calm, expressive and open. He lifted his hands. Fiona froze. Brian's rough, dirt-stained fingers moved. But they didn't move with the stiff, textbook rigidity of Fiona's signing. They flowed. It was a beautiful, seamless, kinetic dance. The syntax was perfect, the facial expressions matching the signs with native-level fluency. "That guy was silly," Brian signed, his face pulling a perfectly exaggerated, comical grimace that mimicked the waiter's overly enthusiastic face. "He talked like a cartoon dog." Chloe blinked. Her mouth fell open slightly. She looked at Fiona, as if to check if this was a hallucination, then looked back at Brian. Brian continued, his hands moving with quiet confidence. "Butter noodles are the best anyway. I like to put extra cheese on mine." The silence at the table was absolute, save for the ambient noise of the restaurant that Fiona suddenly couldn't hear at all. Chloe's rigid posture melted. The tight coil of anxiety in her small frame unspooled in real time. She pulled her knees down from her chest. Her tiny hands came up. "No cheese," Chloe signed back, her movements fast and excited. "Just butter. Cheese is yellow mud." Brian threw his head back and laughed. A genuine deep rumble that vibrated across the table. He signed back immediately, his hands a blur of effortless communication. "Yellow mud. I will remember that. My son Toby eats crayons. Red is his favorite flavor." Chloe looked over at Toby, who was still aggressively coloring, entirely oblivious to the silent conversation happening above his head. For the first time in weeks, a genuine, radiant smile broke across Chloe's face. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners, lighting up her entire expression. She let out a soft, breathy giggle. Fiona sat paralyzed. Her chest felt tight, constricted by a massive, twisting knot of contradictory emotions. Her first instinct was a violent flash of jealousy. It was ugly and sharp. She had spent a fortune, cried in the shower, and read endless books trying to get that exact smile from her daughter. And this stranger in a cheap jacket just pulled it out of her in 30 seconds, with a joke about yellow mud. But following the jealousy came a wave of relief so profound it made her dizzy. Someone saw her daughter. Someone didn't see a broken thing that needed fixing, or a liability that needed accommodation. He just saw a kid who liked buttered noodles. Brian finished his conversation with Chloe, giving her a small thumbs up, which she enthusiastically returned. He then leaned back in his booth and looked at Fiona. He didn't look smug. He didn't look like a man expecting a medal. He just picked up his water glass again. "Sorry," Brian murmured, keeping his voice low. I shouldn't have stepped in. I just know how overwhelming these places can be when you can't filter the noise. Fiona swallowed hard. The defensive corporate armor she wore like a second skin felt incredibly heavy, and suddenly completely useless. She looked at his hands, resting on the table. The calluses, the faded scars. Where did you learn to sign like that? She asked. Her voice cracked, stripping away the CEO, leaving only the exhausted mother. Brian looked down at his glass, tracing the rim with a rough thumb. The easy, confident aura he had while signing faded, replaced by a quiet, heavy sorrow. My younger brother, Brian said softly. He was deaf. Fiona caught the past tense. Was. She looked at Brian. Really looked at him for the first time. Past the faded jacket and the tired eyes, she saw a man who carried a grief so heavy it had settled into his bones. Yet he used it to build a bridge for a little girl he had just met. Brian, Fiona started, the cynical edge entirely gone from her voice. But before she could finish the thought, Toby finally dropped his red crayon, looked up, and loudly announced, I have to pee. The spell broke. Chloe laughed again, pointing at Toby, and Brian rubbed his face, letting out a long sigh. Right on cue, buddy, Brian said, sliding out of the booth. Excuse us a minute, Fiona. As she watched him walk towards the restrooms, a small hand tugged on Fiona's sleeve. She looked down. Chloe was looking at her, her eyes bright, her hands moving with a fluid, joyous energy. I like him, Mom. He is funny. Fiona stared at her daughter's hands, then looked back toward the hallway where Brian had disappeared. For the first time in a very long time, Fiona didn't have a strategy, a forecast, or a plan. She just had a strange, terrifying flutter of hope in her chest. Plates clattered against the raw edge of the wooden table. The waiter, newly subdued, slid a shallow bowl of pale, steaming noodles in front of Chloe. Beside it, he placed a cast-iron skillet of bubbling macaroni for Toby and a meticulously arranged plate of seared scallops for Fiona. The smell of brown butter and sharp parmesan instantly overwhelmed the faint scent of rain clinging to Brian's jacket as he returned and slid back into the booth. Fiona stared at her scallops. They looked like small, perfectly seared hockey pucks resting in a smear of radioactive green pea puree. She suddenly had zero appetite. So, Fiona began, her voice tight. She picked up her heavy silver fork, desperate to anchor herself to a normal, adult conversation. To regain the upper hand. Landscape architecture. Are you primarily residential, or do you handle commercial contracts? The margins on municipal zoning projects can be incredibly lucrative if you navigate the bureaucratic red tape. It was a test, a reflex. She wanted to see if he would scramble to impress her, to inflate his status to match hers. Brian cut a piece of grilled chicken on his plate. He didn't look up immediately. He chewed, swallowed, and took a drink of water. Neither, mostly, Brian said, leaning his forearms on the table. The cuffs of his Henley were pushed up, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle and dusted with fine, dark hair. I work with a small crew. We restore native habitats. Burn scars mostly. Places where wildfires wiped out the topsoil, or where invasive species choked out the local flora. It's not lucrative. It's slow. You plant a sapling, you wait 10 years, and maybe, if the soil takes, it survives. Fiona stopped pushing the pea puree around her plate. That sounds frustratingly inefficient. It is, Brian agreed easily. Nature doesn't care about quarterly earnings, Fiona. It operates on its own timeline. You can't bully a Douglas fir into growing faster. He wasn't mocking her, but the parallel hung in the air between them, thick and unavoidable. She spent her life bullying metrics, employees, and markets into moving faster. She tried to bully her own daughter's deafness into submission with expensive tutors and rigid schedules. Fiona looked at Chloe. The little girl was eating her noodles, perfectly content, her eyes darting between Brian and her mother. She wasn't tapping the table. She wasn't shrinking into the leather booth. "Your brother," Fiona said softly, surprising herself. She didn't usually pry. Vulnerability made her itch. "How did you— you sign like it's your first language." Brian's face softened. The rough edges of his jaw seemed to relax. "Meningitis. He lost his hearing when he was 6. I was 10. My parents were— well, they were from a different generation. They thought if they just spoke louder and forced him to read lips, he'd be fine." Brian's tea-coloured eyes grew distant, fixing on the flickering Edison bulb above them. He started pulling out his own eyelashes, just tearing them out from the stress of being constantly misunderstood. Fiona felt a cold spike of horror in her chest. She looked down at Chloe's perfectly intact, long, dark lashes. "So I checked a book out of the library," Brian continued, his voice dropping to a quiet rumble. "I taught myself. Then I taught him. We created our own little world where nobody had to yell. You either learn to speak their language or you watch them disappear. I wasn't going to let him disappear." Fiona swallowed. The expensive wine she had ordered tasted like ash in her mouth. You either learn to speak their language or you watch them disappear. The words echoed in her skull, perfectly articulating the exact, terrifying dynamic she had been experiencing with Chloe for the past year. She felt a sudden, humiliating prickle of tears behind her eyes. She blinked rapidly, furious with herself. She was Fiona Hayes. She did not cry in trendy bistros over a bowl of scallops. Across the table, Toby suddenly knocked over his glass of water. The heavy tumbler tipped, sending a tidal wave of ice and water across the wood, soaking the corner of Chloe's placemat. Fiona flinched, her heart rate spiking. She immediately reached for a napkin, her mouth opening to issue a sharp reprimand. Chaos. This was exactly why she avoided these outings. But Brian didn't yell. He didn't sigh heavily or act embarrassed. He calmly grabbed a handful of cloth napkins, tossed them over the puddle to stop the spread, and looked at his son. "Damn it, Tobe," Brian said, but there was no heat in it, just weary resignation. He looked over at Chloe, who had pulled her arms back to avoid the water. Brian's hands came up. "Boys are clumsy," he signed, rolling his eyes theatrically. "He drinks like a messy puppy." Chloe let out a loud, ringing laugh. It was a sound Fiona hadn't heard in months, a full-bellied, unself-conscious bark of joy. Chloe signed back rapidly, her small fingers flying. "Puppy needs a towel." Fiona watched them, her chest aching. She wanted to join in. She wanted to be part of the joke. She raised her own hands, forcing her stiff fingers into position. "Yes, very." She struggled for the sign for messy, her mind going blank under pressure. She ended up signing dirty, but her palm was facing the wrong way, making the gesture aggressive and nonsensical. Chloe frowned, confused. Before Fiona could pull her hands down in defeat, Brian reached across the table, his fingers gently wrapped around her wrists. His skin was warm, his calluses rough against her smooth, lotion-softened skin. He didn't pull her hands down. Instead, he gently rotated her wrists, physically guiding her fingers into the correct shape. "Fingers loose," he murmured, his voice low, strictly for her ears. "You're signing like you're giving a presentation. Relax your shoulders. It's a conversation, not a contract." He guided her hand to her chin, making the correct sign for messy. The physical contact sent a jolt of electricity straight up Fiona's arm, settling in the back of her neck. It had been so long since someone had touched her with simple, uncomplicated intention. No underlying motives, no power plays, just a quiet correction. She looked up at him. His eyes were focused on her hands, treating the moment with a quiet respect. He let go and leaned back. Fiona repeated the sign to Chloe, smoothly this time. Very messy. Chloe smiled and nodded vigorously. Fiona dropped her hands to her lap, her skin still burning where Brian had touched her. She felt entirely stripped bare. The CEO armor was gone, lying in a useless heap on the floor of the restaurant. In its place was just a woman, terrified of failing her daughter, sitting across from a man who seemed to breathe the very air she was suffocating in. Dinner concluded with the jarring return of the waiter bearing a black leather billfold. Fiona's instincts immediately overrode her emotional paralysis. She reached into her trench coat pocket, sliding out a sleek, heavy metal credit card. She placed it firmly on the tray before Brian could even reach for his wallet. "I've got this," Fiona said, her tone leaving zero room for negotiation. It was the voice she used to close deals. Brian looked at the black card, then up at Fiona. He didn't look emasculated or offended, which was the reaction she usually got from men when she asserted financial dominance. He just looked faintly amused. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out a worn leather wallet, and extracted a crumpled $20 bill. He placed it gently on top of her metal card. "For Toby's mac and cheese," Brian said gently. "I don't let people buy my kids dinner on the first date. It sets a bad precedent." Fiona stared at the crumpled paper money. It was such a small, stubborn boundary. "Brian, it's fine. It's a business expense." The lie slipped out automatically. Brian's amusement faded, replaced by a quiet, piercing look. "This isn't a business meeting, Fiona." He stood up, grabbing his corduroy jacket. He helped Toby down from the booth. Fiona felt a hot flush of shame. He was right. She had used her money as a shield, a way to reassert control after spending the last hour feeling entirely out of her depth. She silently handed the tray back to the waiter, the 20 still sitting on top of her card. The walk out of Lumina was stark. The Seattle evening had fully descended, bringing with it a heavy, driving rain. The neon sign of the restaurant bled pink and harsh white into the deep puddles on the uneven pavement. The air smelled of wet asphalt, ozone, and rotting autumn leaves. Fiona shivered, pulling the collar of her gabardine coat tight around her neck. Brian didn't have an umbrella. He simply draped his jacket over Toby's head, creating a makeshift tent. He stood in his thin Henley, the icy rain immediately darkening the grey fabric against his broad shoulders. They walked toward the parking lot. Fiona's matte black Range Rover sat under a street lamp, sleek and imposing, looking like a military vehicle. A few spaces down sat Brian's truck, an older, faded blue Ford, F-150, with a dented tailgate and bags of topsoil visible in the bed. The contrast was so aggressive, it almost felt like a joke. They stopped between the two vehicles. The rain was loud, drumming a chaotic rhythm against the metal roofs. "Well," Fiona said, raising her voice slightly over the downpour. She felt incredibly awkward. She had no script for this. "Thank you for stepping in earlier, with the waiter, and with Chloe." "You don't need to thank me for that," Brian said, wiping wet hair out of his eyes. He looked down at Chloe, who was standing close to Fiona's leg, sheltered by the overhang of the SUV. Brian crouched down, ignoring the puddle soaking into the knee of his jeans. He brought his hands up. "Nice to meet you, noodle girl," he signed, his face open and warm. Chloe stepped away from Fiona. She didn't hesitate. She signed back, her movements incredibly fluid and expressive. "You too, Mudman. See you later." Brian chuckled, a warm sound that felt entirely out of place in the freezing rain. He stood up and turned to Fiona. The ambient light from the street lamp caught the silver threads in his wet hair. He looked tired. He looked like a man who worked hard, slept little, and carried a world of quiet grief. Yet, he was the most anchored human being Fiona had ever met. "She's a great kid, Fiona," Brian said quietly. "She's not broken. She's just waiting for you to catch up." The words hit Fiona like a physical blow to the sternum. They were harsh, true, and incredibly kind all at once. She didn't feel defensive. She just felt an overwhelming sense of relief that someone had finally said it out loud. "I know," Fiona whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Brian nodded once. He didn't ask for her number. He didn't suggest a second date. He respected the chasm between their lives, the billionaire CEO and the dirt-stained landscaper. He turned toward his truck, placing a hand on Toby's shoulder to guide him. "Have a good night, Fiona. Drive safe," he called back. Fiona unlocked the Range Rover. The heavy doors clicked open with a satisfying, expensive thud. She helped Chloe into the back seat, buckled her in, and closed the door. She stood in the rain for a moment, her hand resting on the cold door handle. She watched Brian lift Toby into the cab of the rusty Ford. She watched him walk around to the driver's side, his shirt plastered to his back, water dripping from his jaw. Fiona Hayes spent her life calculating risk. She fired executives who hesitated. She dismantled companies that showed weakness. She did not chase men in parking lots, but as Brian reached for the handle of his truck, a sudden, terrifying realization gripped her. If she got into her quiet, leather-lined SUV right now, she would go back to the silent penthouse. She would go back to the awkward, halting conversations with her daughter. She would go back to being the armor-plated CEO who had forgotten how to breathe. She let go of the door handle. Her expensive heels splashed into a puddle as she took a step toward his truck. "Brian!" she called out, her voice cracking, breaking through the sound of the rain. He stopped, his hand on the door, and turned back to look at her. Fiona closed the distance between them. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. She was freezing, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her mascara likely ruined. She felt completely stripped of her power, and yet strangely alive. She stopped a few feet from him. The smell of cedar, wet wool, and damp earth radiated from him. I don't want to just catch up," Fiona said, her breath pluming in the cold air. She looked at his rough, scarred hands resting on the truck door, then up at his tea-colored eyes. "I want you to teach me. I want you to teach me how to talk to her." Brian looked at her for a long, silent moment. The rain fell between them, heavy and persistent. He studied her face, looking past the expensive clothes and the defensive posture, seeing the desperate, raw fear of a mother who was begging for a lifeline. Slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "I charge by the hour," Brian said softly, "and I don't take corporate cards." Fiona let out a shaky breath that was half laugh, half sob. "I think I can find some cash." Rows of heavy terracotta pots lined the floor of the greenhouse, breathing a thick, humid scent of peat moss and decaying leaves into the air. Condensation beaded on the corrugated plastic roof, occasionally dropping with a hollow plink onto the dirt-packed floor. Fiona stood in the center of the aisle, wearing a tailored navy blazer and slate-grey slacks that cost more than the rusted Ford truck parked outside. She felt completely out of place. Her Louboutin heels were slowly sinking into the damp earth. Brian sat on an overturned milk crate, a bag of perlite ripped open at his feet. He wore faded denim and a thermal shirt, his hands buried halfway to the wrists in dark, rich potting soil. He was repotting a line of fragile-looking ferns. He didn't look up immediately as she approached, finishing the rhythmic packing of dirt around the roots before wiping his hands on a filthy rag. "You're late," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the humid air. "I had a conference call with Tokyo that ran over," Fiona replied, automatically, her defense mechanism engaging before she even realized it. Time zones don't wait for Seattle traffic. Brian stood up, tossing the rag onto a nearby bench. "Plants don't care about Tokyo, Fiona. Neither does ASL. You're wound up so tight you're going to snap a tendon. Shake it out." Fiona stiffened. Nobody told her to shake it out. People deferred to her. They brought her coffee and nodded at her forecasts. But she was the one who had practically begged him in the rain 3 days ago. So she swallowed her pride, rolled her shoulders, and let out a short, sharp exhale. "Better," Brian murmured. He walked over to her, closing the physical distance. The smell of cedar, damp soil, and strong black coffee radiated from him. Lesson 1. ASL is not English on your hands. You're trying to directly translate your corporate emails into gestures. It doesn't work like that. It's spatial, it's visual, and most importantly, it's all in the face. He stepped back and raised his hands. "I am angry," he signed. But it wasn't just his hands. His dark eyebrows pulled down sharply, his jaw clenched, and his eyes narrowed. The intensity of his expression was sudden and arresting. It felt like a physical threat, heavy and real. Then his face completely changed. His eyebrows shot up, his eyes widened, and his posture loosened. He made the exact same hand gesture. "Now," Brian said, dropping his hands. "What did that second one mean?" Fiona frowned. "You just signed angry again, but you looked surprised." "Exactly. The manual sign was angry. The facial grammar made it a question. Am I angry? Or in context, are you angry? If you sign with a dead face, you are speaking in a monotone drone. You're a robot. Chloe is bored because you're speaking to her in a dial-up modem." The criticism stung, sharp and precise. Fiona crossed her arms, digging her nails into the cashmere of her sleeves. "I am not a naturally emotive person, Brian. I negotiate multi-million-dollar acquisitions. If I show emotion at the table, I lose leverage." "You aren't at the table," Brian said softly. "You're with your daughter. You need to drop the armor." He walked behind her, gently gripping her shoulders and turning her to face a large, dirt-smudged window at the end of the greenhouse. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, sharp-featured, severely composed. "Look at yourself," he instructed, stepping back so she was forced to confront her own image. "Sign happy." Fiona brought her hands flat, brushing them upward on her chest in quick, rhythmic motions. Her face remained a mask of polite indifference. "You look like you're plotting a murder," Brian noted dryly from behind her. "Shut up," she snapped, a genuine flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck. "Try again, and this time, look happy. Raise your eyebrows, smile, not a polite boardroom smile, a real one." Fiona gritted her teeth. She forced the corners of her mouth up, feeling the unnatural stretch of her facial muscles. She made the sign again. She felt absolutely ridiculous, like a clown pantomiming for loose change. "Still rigid," Brian observed, stepping into her line of sight in the reflection. "You're thinking too much. You're trying to outsmart a language. You can't. You have to feel it." He turned her around to face him. He didn't touch her hands this time, He just held her gaze. His eyes were deeply observant, devoid of any judgment, just stripping away the layers she had spent years building. "When was the last time you let yourself be completely, stupidly silly?" he asked. Fiona blinked. The question threw her off balance. "I don't have time for silly." "Make time. Chloe is 7. She lives in a silent world. Her entire reality is constructed of visual input. If your face is a blank wall, she has nothing to read. She needs color, Fiona. She needs expression," Brian demonstrated. He began to tell a story about Toby getting chased by a rogue goose at the park. His hands moved with blinding speed, but Fiona couldn't take her eyes off his face. It was completely unguarded. He puffed out his cheeks to mimic the fat goose. He widened his eyes in mock terror. He scrunched his nose in disgust. He was a grown man, a rugged, calloused labourer, and he looked entirely foolish and incredibly vibrant. Fiona watched the fluid, kinetic energy of his storytelling, feeling a sudden, hollow ache in her chest. She wanted that. She wanted to bridge the vast, terrifying silence between her and her daughter with that kind of life. She took a deep breath, dropping her arms to her sides. "Okay," Fiona said, her voice shaking slightly, shedding the CEO cadence. "Show me the goose." For the next 2 hours, the billionaire negotiated with her own pride. She puffed her cheeks. She furrowed her brow. She signed until her forearms burned and her wrists ached. She stumbled. She made mistakes. And twice, she got so frustrated she swore loudly into the damp air. Brian just handed her a bottle of water and made her do it again. When she finally walked out to her car, her blazer was smudged with dirt, her hair was escaping its severe twist, and her face felt exhausted from contorting into expressions she had banned from her repertoire a decade ago. She got into the quiet, leather-scented cocoon of her SUV, gripping the steering wheel. She didn't feel powerful. She felt raw, exposed, and utterly exhausted. And yet, as she put the car in drive, the corners of her mouth twitched upward into a genuine, unforced smile. Silence in the penthouse was not an absence of noise. It was a physical weight. It pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, swallowing the distant, muffled sirens of downtown Seattle. The air smelled of expensive, ozone-filtered air conditioning and the subtle, sterile scent of lemon wax on hardwood. Fiona dropped her keys onto the marble entryway console. The metallic clatter echoed sharply, highlighting the emptiness of the massive space. It was 7 p.m. on a Thursday. Her nanny, Maria, had already left. Fiona walked down the long, gallery-lit hallway toward Chloe's room. She carried the exhaustion of a 12-hour workday in her bones, her mind a tangled web of market projections, investor demands, and the lingering ache in her forearms from Tuesday's session at Brian's greenhouse. The door to Chloe's room was slightly ajar. Fiona pushed it open. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the penthouse. It was an explosion of color and texture. Velvet pillows, high-contrast abstract paintings, and a massive, low-frequency subwoofer hooked up to a sound system, so Chloe could feel the heavy bass of music through the floor. Chloe was sitting cross-legged on the plush rug. She wasn't playing. She was systematically tearing a drawing into tiny, jagged pieces. Fiona's heart did that familiar, heavy stutter. The immediate instinct was to intervene, to manage the situation like a crisis. "Stop that! What's wrong? Let me fix it." She took a step forward, her hand reaching out. But Chloe didn't hear her coming. The child just kept tearing the thick paper, her small shoulders rigid, her face locked in a tight, pale mask of absolute frustration. Fiona froze. She remembered Brian's voice, rough and quiet in the humid greenhouse. "If your face is a blank wall, she has nothing to read." She needs color, Fiona. Instead of tapping Chloe on the shoulder, a sudden touch that often startled her when she was distressed, Fiona knelt on the hardwood floor just off the edge of the rug. She balled her hand into a fist and struck the floorboards. Thump, thump. The heavy, rhythmic vibration travelled through the wood. Chloe stopped tearing the paper. She didn't turn around immediately, but the stiff line of her spine hitched. Fiona struck the floor again, harder. Thump. Chloe turned her head, her green eyes wide and defensive. Her cheeks were flushed, stained with the shiny tracks of silent tears. She looked at her mother, waiting for the inevitable, robotic ASL lecture. Fiona swallowed the lump of panic in her throat. She didn't sign "what wrong" with her usual stiff, demanding posture. She dropped her purse onto the floor. She sat cross-legged, mirroring Chloe's position, uncaring that her silk skirt was pooling on the carpet. She looked at the torn pieces of paper, then up at Chloe's face. Fiona took a deep breath, fighting a decade of corporate conditioning. She let her shoulders slump. She allowed the exhaustion, the worry, and the raw empathy to flood her features. She pulled her eyebrows down into a deep frown of concern, her eyes softening. She brought her hands up. Her movements weren't sharp or clipped. They were slow, deliberate, and gentle. "Rough day," Fiona signed. Her face matched the sign perfectly, a weary, empathetic grimace. Chloe stared. She blinked rapidly, her hands hesitating over the shredded paper. She was so used to her mother projecting stoic perfection that this display of messy, open emotion seemed to short-circuit her anger. Chloe's lower lip trembled. Her small hands came up, moving in quick, angry bursts. "Girl at school, Lily. She pushed me, said I am weird." Chloe didn't just sign the words. Her whole body vibrated with the injustice of it. She scrunched her face, mimicking Lily's mocking expression. Fiona felt a spike of pure, maternal rage. The CEO in her immediately wanted to pull strings. She wanted to call the principal, threaten the board, and have this Lily expelled by morning. She wanted to fix it with power. She almost broke the connection. She almost stood up to grab her phone, but she stayed on the floor. She kept her hands in Chloe's line of sight. Fiona forced the anger down, transforming it into solidarity. She exaggerated her facial expression, puffing her cheeks slightly and rolling her eyes, a trick she had practiced in front of her bathroom mirror for 3 hours last night, feeling like an absolute idiot. "Lily is silly," Fiona signed, pulling a ridiculous, goofy face. "Lily has mud in her brain." Chloe gasped silently. Her hands dropped. She stared at her mother, eyes wide with shock. Her sophisticated, untouchable mother had just signed the word mud, and she had looked incredibly, wonderfully stupid doing it. A tiny, breathy giggle escaped Chloe's lips. It was a fragile sound, breaking through the heavy silence of the room. Fiona felt a rush of adrenaline stronger than closing any acquisition. She pressed the advantage, abandoning her dignity completely. She mirrored Brian's kinetic energy, letting her hands flow. "We should put worms in her lunchbox," Fiona signed, widening her eyes maniacally and mimicking a wriggling worm with her index finger. Chloe threw her head back and laughed, a bright, percussive sound that bounced off the high ceilings. She scrambled forward on her knees, her hands flying in rapid, joyous agreement. "Yes, big worms, fat ones." Fiona laughed too, a real, chest-deep laugh that felt foreign and entirely liberating. She reached out, abandoning the signs, and pulled her daughter into a tight, fierce embrace. Chloe didn't stiffen. She melted into Fiona's chest, burying her face against the expensive silk of her blouse, her small arms wrapping tightly around Fiona's neck. Fiona squeezed her eyes shut, burying her nose in Chloe's hair. It smelled of strawberry shampoo and the faint, dusty scent of the playground. The silence of the penthouse was still there, vast and sprawling, but for the first time in a year, it didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a canvas. Over Chloe's shoulder, Fiona opened her eyes. The reflection in the darkened window showed a billionaire sitting on the floor. Her clothes wrinkled, her hair messy, holding tightly to the only asset that actually mattered. She wasn't an imposter anymore. She was just a mother, finally learning how to speak. Gravel crunched heavily under the tires of the Range Rover as Fiona pulled onto the shoulder of a winding utility road in the Cascade foothills. She killed the engine. The dashboard clock read 10:14 a.m. on a Saturday. Her phone sat in the cup holder, vibrating violently. It was her chief operating officer. Again. The acquisition in Tokyo was bleeding capital, and the board was demanding a weekend conference call to stop the hemorrhage. Fiona ignored it. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the crisp, pine-scented air. She wore jeans, actual stiff, dark-wash denim that felt completely alien against her skin, paired with a plain grey sweater and boots she had bought 30 minutes ago at a sporting goods store. The boots were already collecting a fine layer of dust. 100 yards down the slope, a patch of land scarred by a recent brush fire was crawling with activity. A team of 4 people in high-visibility vests were planting saplings into the blackened earth. Brian was at the center of it. He wore a faded flannel shirt, his sleeves rolled up, driving a spade into the hard-packed dirt with rhythmic mechanical force. Toby and Chloe were sitting on a canvas tarp nearby. Toby was enthusiastically sorting a pile of rocks, while Chloe watched him, her legs crossed, a smudge of soot on her left cheek. Fiona didn't march down the hill with her usual commanding stride. She walked carefully, feeling the uneven terrain through the stiff soles of her new boots. The air smelled of sharp wood smoke, damp soil, and the metallic tang of cold morning dew. Brian saw her approach. He leaned his weight against the handle of the spade, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his dirt-caked forearm. He didn't look surprised. He just watched her navigate the rough ground. "You look like you're about to inspect a mining operation, Fiona," Brian called out, his voice rough and carrying over the breeze. "I'm wearing denim," Fiona replied, stopping a few feet away. She felt defensively out of place. "I was told this was the uniform." Brian chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "The tags are still on your boots." Fiona looked down. A small white barcode sticker was glaringly visible on the heel. She felt a flash of irritation, reached down and ripped it off. "I am out of my element. Acknowledge it and let's move on." "Fair enough." Brian drove the spade back into the dirt. "What are you doing here? I thought you had a weekend summit." "I did," Fiona said. She looked over at the tarp. Chloe had noticed her. The little girl stood up, abandoning the rocks. Fiona took a deep breath. She dropped the tense, defensive posture. She let her shoulders relax. She looked directly at her daughter, widening her eyes in exaggerated shock, pointing at the soot on Chloe's face. "Your face is dirty," Fiona signed. Her movements were looser now, less mechanical. She scrunched her nose to emphasize the point. "You look like a raccoon." Chloe's jaw dropped. She immediately rubbed her cheek, smearing the soot further across her skin. She glared at Fiona playfully and brought her hands up. "I am helping," Chloe signed, her small fingers moving with rapid defiance. "We are making trees. Trees do not grow in dirt, they grow in mud." "You need water," Fiona signed back, keeping her face bright, animated and entirely focused. She didn't stumble over the syntax. She didn't freeze. She just talked to her kid. Chloe laughed, pointing at a thermos of water sitting near Toby. I will pour water on Toby. Good plan, Fiona signed, giving a quick, firm thumbs up. When Fiona finally broke the visual connection and looked back, Brian was staring at her. The spade was abandoned in the dirt. He wasn't smiling, but his tea-coloured eyes were intensely focused on her face, stripping away the billionaire, the CEO, the armour. You practiced, he said quietly. Every night, Fiona admitted, her voice dropping. The bravado was gone. In the mirror, I feel like an idiot most of the time. You don't look like an idiot. Brian stepped closer. The smell of physical labour, sweat, crushed cedar, and warm flannel was intoxicating. You look like a mother. In Fiona's pocket, her phone began to vibrate again, a frantic mechanical buzzing against her hip. The Tokyo crisis, millions of dollars hanging on her ability to ruthlessly dismantle a competitor's argument. She didn't reach for it. She looked at Brian's hands, stained with carbon and earth. Give me a shovel, Fiona said. Brian raised an eyebrow. You'll ruin your manicure. I can buy a new manicure, Brian. Give me the damn shovel. He didn't argue. He reached into the bed of a nearby utility cart and tossed her a short-handled spade. She caught it awkwardly, the rough wood scraping her palm. She walked over to the line of dug holes, dropped to her knees in the dirt, and picked up a fragile, green sapling. The soil was cold and wet. It immediately packed under her fingernails, ruining a $200 gel set. Fiona didn't care. For the first time in a decade, she was building something that wasn't made of numbers. She was anchoring something into the ground. They worked in silence for an hour. The only sounds were the scrape of metal against rock, the rustle of dry brush, and the occasional burst of laughter from the tarp, where Toby was entirely failing to teach Chloe how to juggle pine cones. Fiona's muscles ached. Her lower back throbbed. But the heavy, suffocating anxiety that usually sat on her chest like an iron plate was gone. She looked up, wiping a stray hair from her forehead, leaving a streak of dark mud across her pale skin. Brian was watching her again from a few yards away. He didn't use his voice. He just raised his hands, his face softening into a look of profound, quiet respect. Not bad, boss, he signed. Fiona smiled. It wasn't a calculated boardroom smirk. It was a messy, exhausted, radiant smile. Night fell over Seattle, heavy and damp. Brian's house was a small, single-story craftsman in a working-class neighborhood. The porch light flickered, and the gutters needed clearing. It was 3,000 square feet smaller than Fiona's penthouse, and it smelled intensely of roasted garlic, wet dog, and old, polished wood. Fiona stood in the narrow kitchen holding a glass of cheap red wine. She felt entirely unmoored, yet strangely safe. In the living room, Toby and Chloe were watching a cartoon, the volume muted, the subtitles scrolling rapidly across the bottom of the screen. They were sharing a bowl of popcorn, communicating in a chaotic blend of basic signs, pointed fingers, and thrown kernels. Brian was at the stove, stirring a large cast-iron pot of marinara sauce. He had showered, changing into a clean grey t-shirt and sweatpants. He looked domestic, comfortable, and impossibly grounding. Fiona leaned against the scarred laminate counter. She watched the muscles in his back shift as he stirred. My board is going to file a motion of no confidence on Monday, Fiona said suddenly. The words hung in the air, heavy with corporate consequence. She hadn't meant to say it, but the quiet of the kitchen pulled the truth out of her. Because I ignored my phone today. We lost the Tokyo acquisition. Brian stopped stirring. He tapped the wooden spoon against the edge of the pot. Clack, clack. He turned around, leaning his hips against the stove, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Are you going to lose your job?" he asked. His tone wasn't panicked. It was factual. "No," Fiona scoffed, a brief flash of her old arrogance surfacing. "I own 51% of the voting shares. They can yell, but they can't fire me. But they will make my life a living hell for the next 6 months. Does that scare you?" Fiona looked down at her wine glass. The deep red liquid caught the dim light of the range hood. She thought about the hostile emails, the tense meetings, the vicious financial chess games that awaited her on Monday morning. "No," she realized, the truth settling into her bones. "It just exhausts me. It all just feels so loud." Brian tossed the towel onto the counter. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. The kitchen was narrow. There was nowhere for her to step back, and she found she didn't want to. He stood in front of her. He didn't touch her immediately. He just looked down at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Your world is a lot bigger than mine, Fiona," Brian said, his voice a low gravel scrape in the quiet room. "I fix dirt. You own skyscrapers. I can't navigate your boardrooms. I don't want to." "I'm not asking you to," Fiona whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Good." Brian reached out. His large, rough hand gently closed over her wrist. He took the wine glass from her trembling fingers and set it on the counter behind her. He brought his hands up, keeping them close to his chest, right in her line of sight. "I am not complicated," Brian signed, his movements slow, deliberate and fiercely intimate. "I do not play games." Fiona's breath hitched. She looked at his face. The severe grammar of ASL wasn't just in his hands. It was in the intensity of his stare, the slight furrow of his brow, the raw honesty radiating from him. She raised her own hands. They shook slightly, but she forced her fingers into the correct shapes. She didn't care about perfect syntax anymore. She just wanted to be understood. "I am tired of games," Fiona signed back, her expression matching the vulnerability in her chest. "I just want to learn how to be quiet." Brian's face softened. The rough edges of his jaw relaxed. He dropped his hands and reached for her. He didn't kiss her with the polished, practiced grace of the men she usually dated. He kissed her like a man who worked with his hands, firm, grounded, and entirely present. His palm cupped the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His mouth tasted of garlic and cheap wine. Fiona let out a soft, shuddering breath, her hands coming up to grip the fabric of his t-shirt. She anchored herself to him, feeling the solid, unyielding muscle beneath the cotton. For the first time in a decade, Fiona Hayes wasn't calculating her next move. She wasn't forecasting a timeline. She was just existing in a cramped kitchen that smelled like tomatoes, holding on to a man who knew exactly how to speak in the silence. From the living room, a heavy, rhythmic vibration thumped through the floorboards. Thump, thump. Fiona pulled back, her lips swollen, her pulse racing. She looked down the hallway. Chloe was standing in the doorway, staring at them, her green eyes wide. Fiona froze. A spike of panic hit her. Too fast. This is too much for her. But Chloe didn't look upset. She looked at Brian's hand, still resting on Fiona's waist. The little girl crossed her arms, puffed out her cheeks, and brought her hands up. "Yellow Mudman is kissing my mom," Chloe signed, her face a mask of exaggerated, comical disgust. "Gross!" Brian threw his head back and let out a loud, booming laugh. He stepped away from Fiona, signing back rapidly to the little girl, promising her ice cream if she kept it a secret. Fiona leaned back against the counter, pressing a hand to her chest. She watched her daughter laugh, the sound bright and ringing over the low hum of the refrigerator. The silence wasn't an enemy anymore. It wasn't a void that needed to be filled with tutors, schedules, and corporate dominance. It was just a language. And for the first time in her life, Fiona was finally fluent. Wealth can build a fortress, but it takes a calloused hand to finally tear down the walls. Fiona learned that the most important conversations don't happen in boardrooms. They happen in the quiet spaces we are terrified to enter. If Brian and Fiona's messy, beautiful journey reminded you of what really matters, smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who proves that love is an action, not just a word. Don't forget to subscribe for more grounded, emotional stories. Drop a comment below. Who is the anchor in your life?